Right, so I'll delete those two. You can delete them. So I've highlighted them using Shift and clicking the modifiers in that I wanted, and I can just hit delete like that. All right, I'm back to my box, and that brings us what is called the Gizmo. Okay, now if I wanted to move this bit of geometry around the environment, if I've just got select, I can't actually move this thing. Okay, but there's three little icons up here which are very important. We've got one that's called select and move, another called select and rotate, and another one called select and scale. Alright, so if we wanted to actually move this object around, I can highlight the move tool, and this little transformation icon, or it's actually called the Gizmo by Autodesk, pops up, and depending which axis we highlight, we can actually move, rotate, or scale the object in question using the gizmo. Okay, so if I wanted to move the box along the X direction, I can do so like that. Alright, otherwise if I wanted to move it in the YZ plane, I can do that also, or the XZ plane, I can move it along like that. And if you actually know the location that you want to put that box, that's where we can use this little world coordinate system input at the bottom. So I can drop that back to 0, 0, 0 just by writing 0, 0, 0 there. If I wanted to rotate the box, I can do so. And if I want to scale it, I can do that also. But one thing you must note when you actually scale something, the parameters here won't change at the same time. So you kind of make the parameters void. So I'd recommend that if you wanted to scale something, you actually do it using the parameters and a few calculations. So if you wanted this twice the size, 8 by 6 by 6, you kind of get the idea. So I've shown you how to create geometry using the command panels on the right, and we can modify those using a series of modifiers in the drop-down list, such as here. I've also shown you using the gizmo how to actually select and move, select and rotate, and select and scale an object. Another thing we can do is actually clone an object. So cloning is like copying in any other piece of software. What we do is we hold Shift when we have the gizmo active, either by moving, rotating, and scaling, or scaling. So hold down Shift and then click your mouse and you drag the object. Now when we've done that, there are two types of cloning options or cloning states. The first being cloning an object by making a copy, or we can clone an object by making an instance of the original copy. And we can also specify how many copies and a new name if we need to. So first thing I'll do is I will clone an object by copy. So I hit OK. What happens in this example is if we change the object that we've cloned, or the original object that we made a clone from, they act independently. Okay, so they become two independent objects within the scene. The difference with a clone by instance, now I'm just holding Shift again and dragging the object out in the X direction, and I'm hitting this radio button here called instance. I'm pressing OK. Now if I decide to actually change the height of this second object, it'll change the first object at the same time. Okay. Now the third option is called reference, and I'll save that one for a later date. It's just a little bit too tricky. I think it's better if you get your head around copying and instancing first off. Okay. So the way that you can also tell if something is being copied by instance or cloned by, cloned by instance or cloned by copy is the difference in the way that the geometry is represented in the modifier stack. So you can see here box is actually in bold print, and if we clone by copy, such as this, you can see that it's just in a normal font. Alright, so that's how you can tell later on if it's actually going to manipulate more than one. Now another way of actually copying things is by using what's called the array tool. Okay, now I'm just going to zoom out a little bit and put the box kind of there, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to array in the X and the Y direction a series of boxes. And to do that, I go up to Tools, You'll also see there's a mirror tool and an align tool, so you might want to have a play with those. But first of all, I'll show you array. So let's say, for example, what I'll do quickly is I'll just make this look a little bit more like a column. You might have a grid of columns that you're working with. I've got a column that's here now, just editing the parameters, dragging them down to about, let's say, zero point 0.3 by 0.3, so it's 300 by 300 by 9 meters tall as a column. I'll take the number of segments down because I know I don't need them. I don't need all that surplus geometry in the scene, like so. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a column grid, maybe 10 by 10 column grid. And to do that, I go Tools, down to the Array option. And again, we can array by copy or instance. And in the first area, this big area up the top, it allows us to specify the distance in the X, Y, and the Z direction that we want to array this object by. So first of all, we've also got the array dimensions only arraying in one dimension. Okay. If I hit preview and start to set these things out 3 meters apart along the Y direction, you can see what happens. Okay. Well, let's say they're 6 meters apart. They've kind of gone off the screen, but that's okay. I still know how many I'm doing. If I want to array in the other direction, I've got to select that I want to array in 2D. And in this second part, I might specify a count of 10 columns or boxes. They are still boxes. And in this direction, I might array by 4 meters. Okay. And that's pretty much it. Now you can also edit if they curve in one direction. Alright, so I'm rotating these things around the Z direction. Sorry, not the Z direction, the X direction. And you can actually make them go bigger or smaller too. Okay, so there's just a whole heap of options that you may want to work with. And if I have that on instanced, I hit OK, right? There's my column grid. And just to make it a little bit easier to see, I might turn off edged faces. Alright, that's my column grid. And I'll do Alt-W to toggle how many viewports I see, and I might zoom to extensive all. You can see there in plan is a column grid, and then in elevation I can see it as well, and then in my perspective down here. So just to give you an idea that we can still use those 4 viewports. As I've instanced them, I can grab any one of these columns and I can make them smaller or bigger, however I want to do it. Okay, so you might find that useful as well. So the next part of the technical lecture will demonstrate to you guys how to get a two-dimensional rendering of your scene out of the software into a file format such as a JPEG or a TIFF file that we can then put into Photoshop and edit and change and add to using some of the techniques that we've explored earlier, or lay it out directly in InDesign if you're happy with it. What I've done here is I've created a little plane using the Create, under the Create tab, under Standard Primitives, a thing called the plane, and I've given it a dimension of 22 meters by 22 meters, and I've used the array tool that I just showed you to actually get a whole series of them. So it's looks kind of like a really abstracted city grid. All right, and in its native color, it's purple. I've recreated our box, and it's now 8 meters by 8 meters by 40 in height. All right, I might just add a few more height segments and width segments. So it's 10 by 10 by 10. So we've got something that's nicely has a lot of segments that make it up. So if I want to apply a modifier to it, it gives us a nice smooth edge to it. So to render out a raster-based image of this scene, two-dimensional image, we use these 3 little buttons at the end of the main toolbar. The first one, Render Setup, sets up the parameters in which we can render. The output size is probably the most important one for you guys to pay attention to, because it's here that you set how many pixels make up the image. Alright, and we want a high resolution image at the very end when we're exporting to put into our final document. But when we're working with it, we want to keep it low so the software works through the operations really quickly. So you might work with 640 by 480 for a while, and then change the output size up to something like 1600 by 1200 or up if you wanted an image the size of, say, an A5 or maybe even an A4 page. If you want something bigger, I'd push this up even higher. I'd go up like 2400 by 1600 or something even higher and bigger. Okay, and you can lock the aspect ratio, so the width versus the height of the image if you actually wanted to just increase it. But for now, I'm just going to stay at 640 by 480. Down here in this dialog, by default, the save file's turned off. Okay, it would get into it. You get into a habit of actually pressing save file and specifying under files where you're going to actually save this rendering to, this two-dimensional raster-based image. Save it as either a TIFF or a JPEG. I recommend a TIFF because they're uncompressed. Give it a name with a number after it if you want. And then what we can do is we can hit render, and the renderer then runs and it generates an image for us. Okay, so this is an image that if we navigate over to our file is saved here. Okay, and that can be used in InDesign or Photoshop to be laid out. But we've done this in quite a rushed fashion. There's a few other things that I would like to go over. We can have more control over how we see the scene using cameras. Okay, we can also have more control over how the scene is lit or the environment is rendered, and the lighting scenario of this using lights or a daylight system. And we can also apply materials to the objects so they don't render out in their native color that they come in as. So first of all, I'll go through setting up a series of cameras. Again, anything that has to do with actually creating objects, you always go to the Create tab on the command panel. Okay, and what we do is we just go over to Cameras, which is the fourth button across, and the type of camera that I'm going to stress that you use and continue to use is called a target camera. Alright, so what we do is we set up the scene looking through a camera which sets up the perspective that we want to keep. So we select target under camera, it's highlighted, and we can actually set the parameters for this camera straight away, but what I think we should do is just drag it out in the view. So what I do here to create, I've clicked and I'm holding down my mouse button, and I drag out the little target icon, which is that little cube on the end of my cursor, and I put that where I want to look. And then I let go of my mouse and it's created. Now I've selected my move tool, and I've now selected my camera, and I can move that into position. And by default it's going to create it in the Z direction on 0, and it'll place the camera in the X and Y wherever you want it. So to set this camera, what I would recommend is that you actually go to 4 viewports, okay? And you use a combination of front, left, and top view to actually set the location. And in this bottom corner, bottom right corner, instead of having the perspective, I want to look through the camera. So what I do is I press on the perspective word, and up the top we've got a little icon that drops out the camera list, and I press camera 1. So now in this viewport here, and I'll just maximize it to show you a bit bigger, we're looking through the camera at the target point. I can now change the location of this camera by using this the gizmos, as long as I've got select and move highlighted. So I can make it further off the ground, okay? Like so, by dragging it up. I can have a bird's eye view, or I can come down nice and close, so I can have just a walking view. Alright? And I can always check my world coordinate system down here on the bottom to see how high off the ground I am. So I might actually set that height at how tall I am, which is, roughly 1.9 meters. If you're 1.65, set it as 1.65, okay? Now we can change where we look at it from, alright? By moving around, you'll see that it updates in the bottom corner. Okay, and there's a couple of other things we want to change. First of all, we want to change the height of the target. At the moment it's Z on 0. I can fool around, try to actually get in there and select that camera point, but it can be a little bit tricky. The way that you select things when there's more than one bit of geometry or a helper sitting on top of another is using this drop down as part of the selection tools called select by name. And in here I can write in camera, and you'll see that in the stack it comes down and it finds the cameras for me. And I just want camera target, so I highlight that and I hit OK. Then using any one of the windows I can actually drag this up. Alright, so I might actually set it with a high sky, a high up on the tower, so I've got a lot of sky and a little bit of ground. Alright, so we can actually start to work in some of those rules of composition here too. Now, you've got to imagine this thing as any other camera, like a physical camera that you take a photo with. This just is a virtual camera. So if I highlight this, I can modify a series of parameters associated with that. I'll go over to the Modify tab. The first parameter that I can change is the actual lens type. Alright, so your eye, you might find that your eye's natural kind of the equivalent in lenses is probably of a width of about 24 to 28 millimeters. So it actually gives kind of a nice perspective if you float around there. A lot of cameras that just point and shoot cameras, they're usually about a 35mm lens. Okay, and some SLRs will take you down, get you a really wide perspective. It goes down to almost like 15 or 18. Okay, so while you're working with this camera, you can see that the actual field of view is closing when the number's higher, so it's zooming in on the image in the right, and it's widening as we get the number lower. As for the other parameters within here, feel free to move on and have a bit of a play with them, but a lot of them won't work until you actually develop your skills. So we'll stay with, let's say about a 25mm lens. I might just use the top view to move in a little bit closer now, and I can hit render again. So just make sure that you've got the right window highlighted, and what I'll do is I've gone to my render setup here, and I've turned off the little checkbox which says save file, so I don't continually overwrite my file. So I'll just hit render like that. And as you can see, the scene is still flat. We still haven't applied materials, we haven't applied lighting, we haven't got the environment looking how we want it to. So that'll conclude technical lecture number 6, and we will get into materials, lighting, refining rendering, refining the environment, and a few more things to do with workflows and modifiers in the next technical lecture.